I'm going to talk about deaths in detention facilities, ICE detention facilities, some of the changes to the refugee and asylum system, some of the changes to foreign worker categories, with focus particularly on the H-1B visa, and then sort of end with what Trump has basically done to the legal immigration system, especially this year, which is essentially shut it down. So when it comes to deaths in detention, we've seen a sharp increase in the year 2020, the fiscal year, which ended at the end of September, of an increase of up to 21 people who have died in immigrant detention, which is up from 8 people over the 2019 fiscal year. And this is over a time, by the way, when the number of people admitted to ICE detention facilities is much lower than it was in earlier years. So, for instance, in 2019, 511,000 people were admitted to immigration detention. In 2020 fiscal year, it was only about 177,000. So you have a much smaller pool of people going into immigrant detention facilities, but a much larger number of people who are dying. So much so that the death rate in ICE immigration detention in 2020 was 11.8 per 100,000 admissions, which is almost 7 times higher than what it was in 2019, and the second highest that we have on record. The only other year that was slightly higher was in 2004, which is right when they started to actually keep statistics on the number of people who died in immigrant detention facilities. Now, the deaths in ICE detention facilities, on average per year, were highest during the George W. Bush administration. There were 91 total deaths, 2003 to 2008, for a rate of about 6.4 per 100,000. But deaths fell rapidly from 2004 onward. 2004 was just like a terrible year for people dying in immigration detention. So they started to improve dramatically after 2004. During the Obama administration, the death rate continued to fall to 2.3 per 100,000. And we've seen it go up under the Trump administration. It's 3.6 per 100,000. So we're seeing the number of deaths increase as a percentage of those who are admitted. And I want to say one of the main reasons the numbers have fallen this year is because the administration, beginning in March, started to rely on what's called Title 42, which is a legal category that allows them, in the case of a pandemic or public health emergency, to basically close the borders. Anybody apprehended is just turned back immediately to where they came from, or just pushed over the border into Mexico, even if they came from another country, without any kind of due process, without anything like that. So the only reason why these admission numbers into the ICE detention facilities are as low as they are is because they're just expelling unlawful immigrants and other border crossers immediately, without even giving them any due process or any chance to apply for asylum. So that's the reason why those numbers, part of the reason why they look as bad as they do. But no matter how you slice it, no matter how you dice it, the deaths in detention facilities are up. Now, when it comes to the refugee and asylum system, I have some pretty, of course, depressing news. And that is, compared to 2016, the number of refugees admitted in 2019 were down about 85%. And the numbers this year are down even further. And next year, the administration has slated to reduce them. So when they were down from about 85,000 in 2016, last year they were about 11,000. And we suspect that it'll be even lower next year. And when they talk about these different refugee caps that they put in place, last year's there was 18,000. They let in about 11,000. They always under admit. So even if they say they're going to admit 15,000 or 12,000 or 10,000, you can guarantee the number that they actually will admit will be lower than that. So when they have these refugee caps, that's like the uppermost bound for this administration in terms of admissions. If we all remember well, the main justification for reducing asylum, ending these programs, was the national security fear. It was the fear that refugees, particularly Muslim refugees from the Syrian civil war or elsewhere, were a very serious terrorist threat to the United States. But if you take a look at the numbers, you take a look at the number of people killed on US soil from 1975 through the end of 2017 who were admitted as refugees, there were only 3 people killed in terrorist attacks committed by a refugee on US soil. And all of them were in the late 1970s. So that works out to an annual chance of being murdered in a refugee terrorist attack at about 1 in 3.8 billion per year. Very, small chance. It's not a consolation to the victims, of course, but it's a very small chance. And you compare that to the benefits of letting refugees in, and it just doesn't compare. To put that sort of in perspective, the annual chance of being murdered just in a normal homicide during that time period is about 1 in 20,000 per year. So it's just a vastly different comparison. Now, to asylum, I'm afraid it's even more depressing. The government has virtually shut down the asylum system on the southwest border and put in place numerous restrictions and legal loops that asylees have to jump through in order to get asylum, most spectacularly having to wait in Mexico through the MPP program for their court dates. So you have sort of this situation where there are essentially refugee camps on the US border in Mexico. Of course, all that is a huge sham that is intended to raise the costs and make it more difficult for people to gain asylum. Now, moving on to the foreign worker categories, what the administration has done here is that in response to COVID-19, the government has essentially shut down every guest worker visa program in the United States, with the exception of the H-2A program, which is for seasonal agricultural workers who are almost the vast majority are from Mexico. I believe it's over 95% are from Mexico. So those are the only types of workers who are really being admitted in now. This is enormously destructive to the U.S. economy. One example of this is, many of us are able to keep our jobs because we're working remotely. And we're able to do that because of IT services provided. We're able to have this Zoom call because of IT services, right? And if we didn't have these great services, it'd be much more difficult for us to work remotely. And what we've seen is that H-1B workers, the majority of whom work in computer occupations, many of them in IT services, have substantially lowered the price of supplying IT services to the US economy. And as a result, millions of Americans likely are able to keep working because we have access to the skills provided by these workers. But it's not just high skilled workers either. To sort of make it personal for a lot of people, the government did end the J-1 visa for all pairs, which is, a temporary visa for somebody to come in from abroad to live in your home and to take care of your children. And, this isn't a huge visa. It's not used by a huge number of people, but it is overwhelmingly used by higher skilled women, who are mothers, who have jobs and careers. And this provides a great opportunity for them to both be mothers as well as to work. And the government has essentially ended this program. So, if my goal, and it's not my goal, but if my goal were to basically keep a lot of high skilled American women out of the labor force, this would be one way to do it. One of the many policies that one would pursue in order to do that. Now, the government has also introduced in early October a series of regulations that would raise the wages for H-1B workers. And H-1B workers are high-skilled temporary workers in specialty occupations. And the goal of raising these wages is to essentially keep most of them, as many of them as possible, out of the United States, in a fruitless attempt to raise wages for American workers in occupations where wages are already increasing. Now, what's interesting is this regulation, they mess up a lot of the data when they calculate it. They compare different data sets that are incomparable. So they'll take a look at like how much people make in computer occupations in one survey, which is collected in a whole different way from another survey, but then they'll take that wage and apply it to a different survey, and then they'll apply that to a different survey to try to get their magical number of what the wages should be. And as we know from governments messing around with wages and prices, this is all going to end up in a giant mess. So what we basically see is if the government is able to get this regulation through in time, which it seems like they will be able to, it will massively decrease the number of skilled immigrants who are able to come to the United States and force a lot of H-1B workers who are here currently to either change jobs or in some cases to have to leave the country. And the H-1B visa is for most people who get an employment-based green card, sort of one of their early steps in the United States to be able to live and work permanently. And sort of finally and most depressingly, the number of green cards that are being issued by the Trump administration in the second half of 2020. And these are green cards issued to people who are abroad. So I'm not talking about people who are already in the United States and get their green cards. This isn't much affected by that. But if you're abroad and you're waiting for your green card, in the second half of 2020, the number issued dropped by 92%, which is the single largest decline in such a short period of time that we've seen in American history. It is greater than the decline after the government closed its open borders policy with Europe in the 1920s. It's greater than the decline that we saw at the beginning of the Great Depression. It's greater than the decline that we saw at the beginning of World War II or World War I, even. So this is sort of a massive decline. And the government, the Trump administration, when they announced this, they said they were doing it for two reasons. The first reason that they didn't emphasize much was due to COVID, to try to stop the spread of disease internationally. But the second reason, and the main reason, is to try to protect the American labor market, to try to keep jobs for Americans in this sort of misguided, economically illiterate attempt to prevent job losses caused by the virus. So what I suspect is if President Trump gets reelected, he will keep these bans in place for as long as he possibly can, because it ticks a lot of boxes that he wants to achieve, cutting legal immigration. And unfortunately, since the ruling in the case Trump v. Hawaii in 2018, we don't see many practical limits legally as the law currently stands for the president on his ability to cut legal immigration. So we're really in this sort of very worrisome environment with a very few legal checks on what the administration can do in terms of issuing visas to people who are abroad. As much as I complain about immigration law and how terrible it is and restrictive it is, and how much it hurts America's national interests, immigrants, Americans, everybody, the only thing worse than that is this sort of unilateral control in the office of the president to cut immigration wherever he wants for whatever reason he wants. And that's the legal situation that we are in now. So I worry for the future that the debate will be about immigration instead of about Congress and changing the law and operating, in a representative democracy where we debate things in Congress and pass laws, that we're going to a situation where it's basically the president issuing orders with very little oversight. So that's sort of a broader institutional complaint. It's not entirely confined to immigration. It affects trade and lots of other areas. But in immigration, I think, is the area where you can point to the president's authority being very wide and, unfortunately, according to many recent court rulings, without any obvious limits.